Welcome to the Victory Podcast. Today's podcast is from March 14th, 2021. Join us as we continue our study through the book of Hebrews with Pastor Dax.
Hebrews 11, verses 32 through 35a, we'll call it. Let me read that for us. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. And we'll stop right there in the middle of that verse. We're coming up here to the end of Hebrews 11, pretty much the last paragraph. And we've been in Hebrews 11 so long, I wonder, do you remember how the book of Hebrews starts way back in chapter 1? If you look there for just a second, Hebrews 11:1 begins with sort of a working description of what faith is. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So the writer starts off by describing faith as this absolute, unshakable certainty in God's promises. In other words, what he's saying is, as believers, we should be so confident in God's word that it results in a lifestyle of obedience to God's will. Or we could say it this way: authentic faith in God displays itself, works itself out in actual faithfulness to God. It's the kind of faith that Hebrews 11 verse 2 says, by which the people of old, meaning those people who were under the Old Testament system, by which those people received their commendation. And then to reinforce the point that these people of old received their commendation from God, the writer goes on now in Hebrews 11 to cite 16 specific examples with which the Hebrew Christians who were originally reading this letter would have been very familiar. Now, us, maybe not quite as familiar. So that's why we have been taking our time working through these examples that are these examples of faith that are manifested in the lives of people like Noah and Abel and Abraham and Moses. Hebrews 11:4 tells us that such people were righteous. Verse 6 says these kinds of people pleased God. Verse 16 says that God is not ashamed to be called their God. All of that together points to this one common distinguishing feature that all of these men and women share, and that is that their lives were characterized by faith. But a certain kind of faith. A faith that performs. A faith that responds. A faith that, if I can say it this way, gets you up off your backside and gets you doing something. A faith that moves, a faith that acts. And that's a message that we need to hear, lest we start to think of our Christian faith as something separated and isolated, something less than what it really is. So I kind of wonder, how are you doing after all this time in Hebrews 11? If you've been listening to these messages, hearing all of these great examples of what faith really looks like, what effect has that been having on you? Has the reality of your own spiritual lukewarmness in comparison made you a bit uncomfortable, a bit uncertain perhaps? Because really, in going through this chapter, what we're asking is, are you ready to give and spend your life for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ? As opposed to looking ahead to what you've got planned for next weekend, or finally getting that vacation home, or the next business opportunity that might come your way. And one of the effects I've been praying that Hebrews 11 will have on all of us is that we'll be persuaded that faith as just kind of the status quo will never be enough. Not for you individually, not for our church collectively. I hope that you join with me in praying that our faith would be something that is, we see Jesus move through us in ways that accomplish things we could never do by ourselves. And that's really what this passage that we're in this morning is all about, that faith provides people with the power to do what they otherwise never could have done. And we can summarize all of those verses with just really three simple words, and that is authentic faith performs. Authentic faith, genuine faith, real faith performs. It acts. It does something, and it does things that you wouldn't normally be able to do on your own. Authentic faith performs. So the question is, does your faith perform? It's one of the ways that you can assess if your faith is authentic. Or is your faith described better by a different set of words? Words like sluggish, or stale, or indifferent, unresponsive, unburdened, unconcerned. But authentic faith performs. What do I mean by that? Well, let me just read these verses again one more time so they're fresh in our minds here. Verse 32 again. What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Now, if you're paying attention to Hebrews 11, I'm sure you noticed in verse 32, at the very beginning, the writer shifts up his approach. He shifts up his language. Instead of beginning his sentence how he has been through most of the chapter, by faith, and then giving us the name of somebody who, and then describing how that faith worked out in that person's life, instead of that formula, he does something different here. He starts with a rhetorical kind of question. And what more shall I say? What's he getting at? What's he implying? Well, even though he could go on to say much more and give many more examples, it's time to kind of wrap up this lengthy list of people that he's cited as examples of faith. And so to do that, he rattles off 6 names in rapid fire order: Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel. 4 judges, 1 king, and 1 prophet judge. And then that's followed by a reference to an entire group of people he just simply calls the prophets, right? And so that's verse 32, these people who are listed. And then in verses 33 and 34 and this first little bit of 35, what we get is 9 descriptions of the performative faith of people like these. And the way we're going to come at this is we're going to organize those 9 descriptions into 3 groups of 3. So we've got these 6 people listed, 7 really if you count the prophets, 9 descriptions of their faith. We're going to take those 9 descriptions, 3 groups of 3. And what we'll do is we'll call the first group here, these first group of descriptions, exploits. Exploits. Now that's a word that can be a little bit confusing. A lot of times exploit has a negative connotation, like you're exploiting someone, you're taking advantage of someone. That's not what this means. Exploit can also mean, you accomplish a great exploit. You perform some great deed or act. That's what is in view here, these exploits that have been accomplished. So the writer says now that through faith, verse 33, through faith, these people, here's our first group of 3, conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, and obtained promises. These are the exploits we want to look at. But as you just read those three things, it's impossible to miss the fact that it is by faith, and that this faith causes things to happen. Faith does something. Faith performs. This is the point I'm trying to hammer home. This is what authentic faith looks like. It does something. It moves. It acts. And we see it here in the life of the very first person who's named there in verse 32, Gideon. Do you remember Gideon's story from the book of Judges? He lived in a very dark time in Israel's history. It's a time of religious apostasy, living under the oppression of a foreign power in the land, the Midianites. And as is the pattern in the book of Judges, when things finally get so bleak and so desperate that Israel finally cries out to God for help, when we read the story of Gideon, the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh, a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus Christ, shows up on the doorstep of the most unlikely person in the whole nation of Israel, Gideon. And if you remember, he says to Gideon, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And it's funny if you know the story, right? And what's a mighty man of valor, after all? Maybe you picture Braveheart or Thor, somebody who kind of fits the bill of a mighty man of valor. It's not Gideon. It's like the opposite of Gideon. He's anything but that. And in fact, when he hears the angel speak to him, he looks around as if to say, me? Mighty man of valor. But one of the great truths here is that the angel of the Lord addresses Gideon not on the basis of who he was, but on the basis of who he would be by God's grace, who he would become by faith. And so he says to Gideon, "Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian." And Gideon's response, this so-called mighty warrior, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." That's just the kind of guy you want leading you into battle, right? But the Lord makes Gideon a promise. He says, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man." So Gideon goes out, he gathers up as many men as he can find, 32,000 volunteers for this army. That's nothing to shake a stick at. I imagine that Gideon had to be pretty encouraged and impressed that this many men were willing to turn out, 32,000. But almost immediately, God tells Gideon, that's too many. So tell whoever's afraid to just pack it up and go home. And 22,000 men do just that. And if that didn't make Gideon sick to his stomach, God then says, it's still too many. And in fact, just so we don't have to keep doing this again, let's just cut it down to 300, and we'll call it good. And we're not told the number of troops that the Midianites had, but the text does say that those troops lay along the valley like locusts, and that their camels were as numerous as the sands on the seashore. And then, to kind of top it off, God says, "Oh, Gideon, just one more thing. When you take your little army out to make your assault, don't take your spears and your shields and your swords and your bows. Instead, just let each man take a trumpet and a little clay vessel that can hold a torch. And then, well, just leave the rest to me." And of course, kind of like what we saw with the Battle of Jericho, right? This is not just unorthodox. This is suicidal. And yet, Gideon does exactly what God tells him to do. You know the story. The Israelites blow the trumpets, they shatter the jars, and God causes absolute chaos in the Midianite camp. With their swords drawn in their hands, they turn on each other. They defeat themselves without a single drop of Hebrew blood being spilled in the process. It's not how battles are traditionally waged and won. Even Gideon knew that. But in a remarkable act of faith, he took God at his word and he did exactly what God told him to do. And the point is, that is what authentic faith does. It provides people with the power to do what they otherwise never could have done on their own. It acts in response to God's promise to accomplish God's purpose. Faith acts in response to God's promise to accomplish God's purpose. Have you found that to be true in your life? Has God ever asked you to do something that you thought was pretty much impossible? Something that, maybe not impossible, but something that you certainly resisted doing because, kind of like Gideon, all you can really see when God's calling you to do this thing is your own weakness and inadequacy and how you're unqualified. Instead of focusing on the promise God has made and the power God has provided to keep his promises. What is God asking you to do? Maybe it's some simple things. Maybe it's to begin giving regularly, generously, sacrificially even, in keeping with the instructions of the New Testament. Maybe it's to begin witnessing, to lovingly reach out to the non-Christians that God has placed in your life. Maybe it's to begin serving, to use the gifts that the Spirit has given you for the benefit of God's church. Whatever it is, this is what authentic faith does. It takes God at his word and then it acts. And often it acts in a way that makes you uncomfortable. It acts in a way where you have to dare to live out your faith. In the case of Gideon, this faith conquers kingdoms. In Judges chapter 4, only after God's promise is spoken to him by the prophetess Deborah, a timid leader named Barak, his name's there in verse 32, defeats the superior Canaanite army. In Judges 11, an illegitimate son of a prostitute named Jephthah leads Israel to defeat the Ammonites and the Amorites. Authentic faith performs. Kingdoms are conquered by this kind of faith. And also notice in verse 33, it's by this kind of faith that justice is enforced. You see it there? Who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice. Reminds me of another name in verse 32, Samuel, a man who functioned both as a judge and as a prophet in Israel. And as Samuel's death draws near, he does this remarkable thing. He openly invites the people of Israel to judge him, to judge the integrity of his work, of his carrying out of justice that he's performed among them during his service. In fact, here's what he says to the people of Israel. He says, "Here I am. Testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I will restore it to you." And then listen to how the people respond to that. They say, "You have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand." Which is a pretty remarkable statement, right? Because we know this from experience, not just from reading our Bible. The fact is, people in power are notorious for oppressing the people that they are supposed to lead. Not Samuel. His rule among God's people is characterized by a consistent integrity. He couldn't be bribed or bought or manipulated. He truly enforced justice. But the question is why or how? Given the fact that so few people back then and and so few people now actually use their power with integrity? Well, we're told that Samuel exercised his leadership by faith, through faith. Meaning what? That his enforcing justice was the result of his authentic faith in the one who is the judge of all. Because without faith in God, why bother enforcing justice? Especially when allowing injustice is much easier. Sometimes it's even profitable, taking bribes. Have you thought about this before? The only foundation for enforcing any earthly expression of justice is faith in God, because he is the ultimate judge. He is the final display of what justice looks like. It is from him that we get our standard of justice. So this kind of faith, it conquers kingdoms, it enforces justice. These are exploits performed by people who have an authentic faith. And so is this last exploit in this first group of three here. These people obtained promises. Now, we just saw an example of that, right? When Gideon was promised by the angel of Yahweh that he would defeat the Midianites. And acting on the basis of faith, he obtained that promise. David is another name up there in verse 32. God promised David that he would become king over all Israel. So, think about David's life. Why not take out Saul, the existing king, after that promise has been made, when he has the opportunity? Because, Saul had tried to kill David on multiple occasions, but David never retaliates, even when he's given the perfect chance. In fact, he always responds in grace. Why? Simply because he believes that God will keep his word. God will keep his promise. And so there's no need for him to commit any sort of act of sedition against the king. Instead, acting on the basis of faith, David obtains the promise. Or think about the land of Canaan. What is it called in the Bible? The promised land. A land that was promised. How did Israel come to possess that land? What did that look like? Well, in the book of Joshua, we're given kind of a summary. It says, the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he promised to give to their fathers. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Here it is. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. And just thinking about that story of Israel taking possession of the promised land, we saw that a couple of weeks ago. It's in Hebrews 11, verses 30 and 31, with the conquest of the land, the coming into Jericho. And remember, it was the Israelites inheriting the land there, not because they were more powerful than the Canaanites. The reason that they inherited the land is because they took God at his word. Faith believes. And then they did what God said. Faith acts. And as always, in response to that, God kept his promises. You can think of it this way. His faithfulness to us is his answer to our faith in him. We reaffirm our faith in God, and he responds with expressions of faithfulness to what he's promised. So authentic faith performs. And here in this first category, it's displayed in these exploits: kingdoms conquered, justice enforced, promises obtained. So now let's look at this second category here of this kind of faith. We can call this second group of three deliverances. Specifically, we're talking about deliverances from death. So the writer says that these people of faith, verse 33, stopped the mouths of lions. And that includes two of the men listed up in verse 32. Remember, back in Judges chapter 14, filled suddenly with the Spirit of God, Samson, we're told, tore a lion to pieces with his bare hands. We know that David killed a lion while he was shepherding his father's sheep, 1 Samuel 1. One of David's mighty men, Benaiah, killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day, 2 Samuel 23. But you could argue maybe those were perhaps more feats of strength than they were necessarily acts of faith. And so I think, kind of given the flow of what's being laid out here for us, that the deliverance in view here is almost undoubtedly a reference to Daniel. Daniel, who was desperately hated by his enemies for no other reason than the fact that he was faithful. But how do you get rid of a man who's known for being faithful, who's known for his godliness? Well, you double down. You capitalize on the fact that he's going to be committed to the very thing that he says he'll be committed to. And if you remember the story, his enemies do that by convincing the king to pass this decree that forbids prayer to any god except the king himself. But as we've talked about before, when the command of any human authority forbids us from doing what God has commanded, we must be faithful to God and be prepared to live with the consequences of that. And so Daniel does that very thing. He continues to pray, knowing full well that the outcome will very likely result in him being served up for dinner to this pride of lions. And that's exactly what happens. Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, and then that den is sealed shut with this giant stone. And then the next morning, the king comes to the lion's den. He has the stone removed, and he shouts in there, "Oh, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" I wonder, do you think he actually expected to hear a response? But he did. Surprisingly, from inside the den, Daniel calls back, "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me." In fact, the text says that Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, listen to this, because he had trusted in his God. Authentic faith performs. Not only to shut the mouths of lions, but notice also here now, another kind of deliverance, it quenched the power of fire. And I think having just remembered Daniel, the writer now thinks about his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, men who refused to worship an image of King Nebuchadnezzar. And the consequence of their loyalty to Yahweh was that they were thrown into a blazing furnace. But amazingly, right, they're not consumed by the fire. And so when the king demands that they come out of the furnace, this is what we read, the fire had not any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Now, the question is, what enabled those men to remain steadfast to God when the pressure of persecution mounted to the point that it became life-threatening? And the simple answer is faith. Faith. And faith's power to perform. Those three Hebrews tell us, even as they tell King Nebuchadnezzar, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. It was this great deliverance by faith, as was this. Back to verse 34, they escaped the edge of the sword. It's the third example of deliverance. That refers to escaping violent death, the edge of the sword. There are many examples of that in the Old Testament. We've mentioned David escaping Saul on multiple occasions. There's Elijah, of course, escaping the wicked threats of Jezebel. There's the moment when all of God's people are slated to be wiped out under the Persian Empire. Remember that story? And how God delivered his people by the means of the faith of a young woman named Esther, who dared to act and attempt to save God's people even at the risk of her own life. It was an amazing deliverance brought about by Esther's faith. So are you getting the idea here that faith does something, that faith acts that faith performs, it's not just me trying to beat that into your head. It's what the writer's doing here. He's making it redundant for your benefit. And hopefully what it results in is that you will never be able to think of faith in the same way ever again. Because Hebrews 11 won't allow you to do that. Because authentic faith performs. Oh, but I prayed and asked Jesus into my heart when I was 3 years old, and I've lived like a pagan for the next 40 years. That's not authentic faith. Why not? Because authentic faith performs. It acts. It does something. It performs exploits. It accomplishes deliverances. And then lastly here, authentic faith transforms. It transforms. So notice here now in this last group of three, how these transformations happen that take somebody from one condition to an entirely different condition. So the first one is middle of verse 34, we're made strong out of weakness. So that's the transformation, right? Weak, made strong. And of course that kind of reminds me of yet another name listed back up in verse 32. Samson again. Remember the final event in the life of Samson? It's this incredible transformation from weakness to strength. Now, with Samson, right, it's because of his own repeated egregious sins that he has been humiliated in abject weakness. And yet, even despite that, he prays to God for one last manifestation of supernatural power. And so there's Samson standing there. His eyes have been gouged out. His hands are pressed against the load-bearing pillars of this temple of this Philistine god. And that's where God grants Samson's request. With all of his might, he pushes on those pillars, and the temple collapses upon the Philistines. And in that one act of faith, we're told that Samson killed more of God's enemies right then than he had throughout the entirety of the rest of his life. Authentic faith performs. And in this case, it transforms weakness into strength. And then the next two little clauses we're going to take together there to make the second one. Notice that acting on the basis of faith, they became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Take those two together. And the best example of that, I think, probably comes from the life of David. It happens when the Philistine and the Israelite armies are facing off on either side of the valley of Elah. And every day the Philistine champion, Goliath, comes out to taunt and mock God's people. That is, until one day when David, just a young man, walks into the Israelite camp bringing lunch to his brothers. And he can't believe his eyes and his ears. He can't believe that they're letting somebody say these things. His protective pride for the glory of God won't allow this to stand. It can't. And so he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And then he says to cowardly King Saul, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And so young David marches out to fight against Goliath. Goliath curses David in the name of his gods. And then I want to read David's response to Goliath. He says, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And then he says, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. that God would raise up a people with faith like that. Not a faith that is passive and indifferent and asleep. And what happens? You know the story. Goliath is killed. The Philistines run home. And what we get is this graphic portrayal of a faith, a portrayal of a faith that is takes a young shepherd boy and transforms him into Israel's greatest warrior. That he is made powerful, really, from that moment to defeat the enemies of God's people. And then there's a final transformation of faith to see there in that first little bit of verse 35. This is the third one here of this final category. Women receive back their dead by resurrection. And just a brief example of that. Remember when the prophet Elijah stretches himself out on the dead body of the son of the widow of Zarephath? And he cries out to God in faith while he's doing that. "Oh Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And then God, in response to Elijah's faith, did that very thing. So Elijah picked up the child, carried him to his mother, and said, "See, your son lives." That's a transformation. Death to life. So we take all this together, and there's really no simpler way to say it. Authentic faith performs. It accomplishes exploits. It results in deliverances. It affects transformations. There is a living, breathing vitality to authentic faith. And where there is no living, breathing vitality, there is no reason to assume that faith, no matter what is professed, is actually authentic. What does James tell us? For just as the body, apart from the spirit, is dead, so also faith, apart from works, is dead. But on the other hand, authentic faith, God-given, God-generated faith, comes with the power to perform things. And if we expect to make any dent here in the place where we live, if we expect to accomplish anything of real lasting significance for the sake of the gospel, then this is the kind of faith we must learn to have. And listen, I know that can, even though it's meant to be encouraging, can sound discouraging. I know that you might hear that and feel kind of hopeless, because I know that, just like me, your faith is inconsistent at best. And at worst, it's weak and tepid. And maybe you read this list of names in Hebrews 11, you hear these stories of faith, and you think to yourself, well, that's great, but I could never be used like that. Not only is my faith nothing in comparison to this, but then there's the whole problem of my sin that I can't seem to get rid of. But that's exactly what ought to encourage you. Look again at the names that are listed there in those verses. Do any of those people reflect a perfect, consistent faith? No. In every case, their faith was mixed with weakness and inconsistency and sin and failure. Gideon, his faith is so weak he has to constantly ask for signs from God. Barak, he lacks the courage to go into battle until Deborah shows up and agrees to go with him. Samson, his sexual infidelities and his impulsive actions are infamous. Jephthah, you may not remember him as well, but he foolishly makes this vow to sacrifice his own daughter as an offering. Samuel, well, he's a great man, but he's far too passive when it comes to dealing with the wickedness of his sons. And David, well, we know David, the man after God's own heart, and also an adulterer and a murderer. This is the point. Not a single one of these Old Testament saints in Hebrews 11 had a faith that did not falter at some point. And that includes The other names in Hebrews 11, men like Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Moses. John Calvin makes a comment at this point that is spot on. He says, in every saint there is always to be found something reprehensible. So listen to me now. This is why these people are mentioned here in this great catalog of faith. Yes, because they demonstrate, and they do, they demonstrate compellingly that authentic faith performs. Authentic faith does something. But they also, and this is important, they also show us that great faith does not equal spiritual perfection. So hear me, believer, if you're sitting out there and you have sinned yet again, and you fear that now, because of that, God will never use you again, take heart. Because you are exactly the kind of person that God delights to use. God delights to save and to use broken, scarred, fallible, inconsistent, weak sinners like you and me. These names here in Hebrews 11, these stories of faith should remind you of something that you should never forget. And that is that there is only one perfectly consistent man of faith, and his name is Jesus Christ. All these other names, they may be heroes to emulate, but they are not gods to worship. And you can't even go so far as to recast them as perfect people either, because just like you, they are fallen human beings who are in desperate need of a Savior, which is why even though you can learn from them and you can be used like them, the only way to do that is to fix your eyes on the only hero who ever performed authentic faith perfectly. And he did so for your benefit, in your place, to secure your salvation. You see, the gospel doesn't demand perfect faith from you to be saved, because salvation has been secured for you by the perfect faith of Jesus Christ. However, you don't just leave it there. It is in response then to Jesus' perfect faith, out of gratitude for his perfect faith, that the authentic faith that you are given, that you receive, will perform. It will act. Drop your eyes down the page to chapter 12 for a moment. Chapter 12, verse 1. We're getting there soon enough. We're going to be there on Resurrection Sunday, Hebrews 12. Well, here's a sneak preview. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Abel and Abraham and Noah and David and Joshua and Rahab, that great cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. How do we do that? Next clause, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, listen, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Do you see it there? The faith of Jesus performs. His faith performed in his death and burial and resurrection and ascension. And it performed for you, for your benefit. And because of that, when you receive him by faith, your faith will perform too. Because that's what authentic faith does. Authentic faith performs. Let's pray.
Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. We can be found at 193 East Main Street, or you can also look us up at www.yourvictory.org.